Hi, I'm Greg J. Smith, the Canadian writer and cultural worker with Holo. And today I'm joined by American writer and art critic Nora Nahid Khan, who I will introduce shortly. For the fifth episode of Alt History, an online speaker series where we turn to folks on the bleeding edge of art and technology to help us understand lost and forgotten moments in digital culture. So if you've seen our talks, you're familiar with our kind of MO by now, but when we refer to alt history here, we're thinking about this milieu where new technologies and cultural developments that are often synonymous with erasure. So kind of a forgetting why or how we used to do things and what words or communities meant. Addressing moments, practices, and labor that have faded from memory or been outright forgotten. Over the last 3 decades, our goal is not to simply wax nostalgic about the past, but critically engage this erasure or forgetting and use it to make sense of the present. This series is brought to you by the Generation, a Braga, Portugal-based space for creation, performance, and exhibition with the domain of contemporary music and the relationship between art and technology. And my team at Holo. We're an editorial and curatorial platform founded in 2012, focused on tracking emerging trajectories in art, science, and technology. And these interests manifest themselves in a few ways in periodicals, which quite notably, our guest today, Nora, edited the most recent edition of which. We also track interdisciplinary practice and in a timeline at our online platform, holo.mg, and then through collaborations with cultural partners, exactly like you're watching today. So thank you again to Generation for the invitation to host this series. So I'm really thrilled to be joined and reconnect with Nora today. And she's going to be talking about the backlash that flared up about a decade ago in a little known corner of gaming and a derisive genre that was called the walking simulator. Nora is a critic, editor, and curator with a focus on digital visual culture, the politics of software, and philosophy of emerging technology. Up until very recently, she was the executive director of the Project X Foundation for Art and Criticism, which publishes Extra in Los Angeles. She's the co-curator of the next Biennale de l'Image de Mouvement with Andrea Bellini. Her short book, Seeing, Naming, Knowing, on the Logic of Machine Vision, was published by the Brooklyn Rail in 2019. And forthcoming are No Context, AIR and the Stakes for Criticism, The Artificial and the Real, and Kingdom. She has served as an editor at Rhizome, Holo, and Topical Cream. So Nora, please take us on a journey into the weird atmospheric world of walking simulators.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thank you both for having me. It's so nice to reconnect after our year and a half of working, or maybe it was 2 years of working on Holo 3, which I still see being reviewed and folks are referencing, and we get nice notes all the time about, all the work that we put into it. So it was a wonderful collaboration. So I'm glad to continue the conversation. I am going to share my screen and start playing a little bit from this game, Dear Esther. And Greg, let me know if the video is showing fine. It's good. Okay, great. So my lost history, my alt history is very gamer specific because everything comes back to games for me. This was about 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, 2012, when Dear Esther came out. And at the time I'd been playing games for a very long time since I was very young, but I'd also been reviewing games and writing kind of long form essays about, the weird, uncanny aspects of our relationships to games and virtual worlds for Kill Screen, which was a magazine that ran from 2008 to 2015 or 16 in print, I think, and then went online, and was starting to write for Rhizome right about this time. And so I had been long familiar with gamer culture wars about what constitutes a game and what doesn't. Gone Home might be one game that folks are familiar with, a narrative game that was a source of a lot of controversy. It's an interactive exploration simulator where you walk through a house, you open doors and drawers, you look at objects, and you slowly learn about a family. And walking simulators had the term walking simulator had been a derisive term on forums since like the late aughts. But right around 2012, when Dear Esther, this game that we're being walked through right now, was loved and critically acclaimed, in part because folks identified the most interesting aspects as because it being a game that moved past the systemic kind of pieces, the mechanics of a game. So focus kind of on the cutscene element of a game, environmental storytelling, moving past, the puzzle or fighting or extraction elements of some of like the bigger scale games at the time. So Dear Esther was critically acclaimed and also reviled in a series of what I was shocked to find, like over just hundreds of essays and pieces and headlines and forum discussions about whether this constitutes a game or not. And a lot of the arguments centered around whether why this couldn't be a game, because some of the most interesting elements of a game are the parts where you go off-road to kind of appreciate the environment, at least for me and for a niche subset of gamers, enjoying the kind of ambience and atmosphere, which are as much the game as anything. And in Dear Esther, you are this narrator who wanders this windswept island in the Hebrides. You're a man reading letters that you're writing to your dead wife, Esther. And at each new location, you read a new letter to her. So you get a sense of a man in crisis, possibly fleeing from something with kind of ambient guilt that he's carrying around. He's carrying around the ghosts of conversations of people that he's talking to, that he's spoken with, but you never really see anybody else. You're just in his point of view. I can let me just turn the sound up for a second. See if we can find a letter.
Did they assign chapter and verse to the stones and grasses, marking the geography with a superimposed significance that they could actually walk the Bible and inhabit its contradictions? Dear Esther, I met Paul. I made my own little pilgrimage. My Damascus, a small semi-detached on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. We drank coffee in his kitchen and tried to connect to one another. Although he knew I hadn't come in search of an apology, reason or retribution, he still spiraled in panic, thrown high and lucid by his own dented bonnet. Responsibility had made him old. Like us, he'd already passed beyond any conceivable boundary of life.
So super dramatic epistle, super like really, really funny when, to listen to this and in retrospect. I think it was funny then as well. You're, searching for this red light, which might be a lighthouse at the end of the island. But for most of the game simulator experience, you're just, kind of meditating on your own life. You're wondering what you're doing here. And then you start to kind of pay attention to how you're moving through the island, how it changes your orientation to the space around you. There's some suggestion in the narrative of an infection. There's some religious markings. There's lots of tortured monologue. There's been a lot of critique of the style of writing, which one can take or leave. There's a suggestion that there might be people somewhere else on the island. In that narrative we just heard, the narrator remembers drinking coffee with someone he revisits a tension with. He sees a hermit, and we just saw this cave with symbols glowing, bones and paint on the ground. There's ghosts at some point. So it's a really eerie world where you're waiting for something to happen. You're not really in pursuit of anything, and you realize you're just walking, and you don't know why you're there, and you're just puzzling through things that people have said. So Dear Esther really angered more rigorous gamers, self-identified hardcore gamers. People hated the narration, they hated the dialogue, they found it pretentious. And others argued instead for the lighting and the design of the world and just having a beautiful place to walk. Others were enraged that literally all you do is walk forward, as though most games are not also just walking simulators, which we can talk about it. There's just there's a marked lack of gaming in the game. There's nothing to do, there's nothing to defeat, nothing to win, nothing to obtain, and just leaving you to listen and explore. And it started a really important discussion about not defining games or bounding them, and understanding that experiences related to or peripheral to games, including like visual novels, interactive art, all kinds of narrative media, are game-like experiences as well. And you take time to notice the symbols, the pacing, the affect, the emotional narrative as all elements of a game world as well. So in retrospect, as a tiny, tiny piece of alt history that has, come up in different forms over the 10 years after. That initial anger in response to just like a very quiet niche game is very, very funny to me, because obviously you could choose to play whatever you want to, but also tied for me, and thinking about this conversation, to the production of games that's tied to, cultural power, to markets, to capitalist and imperialist narratives about conquest and extraction, and the way that games have been marketed for such a long time. There's an emphasis often in larger video game culture on newness, on better graphics, better gameplay, better mechanics, and gamers often want a return on what they've bought. And so then there's a big demand on developers to produce a game that delivers on the price of the game. So you have these massive 80 to 120 hour games now, like Death Stranding, also a game I really love, which is also a kind of running simulator where you're basically a messenger carrying metal cases over hillsides for hours and hours. Is a perfect pandemic play. So after this came out, despite the backlash, a lot of the games that went on to win a lot of awards globally, like at BAFTA and a lot of game design awards, were indie games, and many of them would walking sims or walking simulators came to dominate a lot of these categories. And they had maybe had less success with console gamers. And I think what I'd love to explore with you, Greg, is this definition of a game being gate kept, and then walking simulators also becoming a kind of entry point for people unfamiliar with games who weren't really interested in a war game with, thousands of levels requiring increased skill and complexity. And I was very good at those games, and I still am very good at those games. But I think the walking simulator became more aligned for me with the really aesthetically and conceptually interesting elements of game worlds that one can only experience in games. So I was a big World of Warcraft player, and in a lot of, even I was good at playing WoW, a lot of the best parts of that game were, standing near an NPC or entering a tavern and, going into a field and watching the moonlight play on on virtual grass, and the deep sense of being in a world. And as games like Dear Esther and Firewatch and Vanishing of Ethan Carter also went on to critical acclaim, it's very interesting that the walking simulator was defined as less than a game, because I would like to think that they also point us to the most important cognitive aspects of games: the role of observation, noting, appreciation, and what you do while you walk in the world. So I think this gatekeeping about what games should be, and the debate around them, is most interesting to me as a critic. I think it's a reflection of the military origin of games, the use of simulators to train and recruit soldiers. Maybe folks know are they're simulators to help working with like memory and trauma processing. And they point to the capacity of a simulation or a simulator to consider our own world, our observation in the world, whether we move on script or off, where we wander, where we choose to wander. And I often find myself, when I go back to play a game like this, like how difficult it is to wander, especially as if one's been playing a game where you are goal-oriented or level-oriented for a time. Thinking about moving away from the high-level mechanics, into moving away from the kind of systemic complexity that, and seeing why these games appeal to a wider audience is interesting. I think a lot of folks have pointed out that the outrage was also about shift and kind of loss of ownership over the sense of being a gamer, and the person who masters a game as a true gamer. The real resistance to that idea that anybody can play a game, and that it's just kind of an ambient part of our life now. So at the time, I ascribed, and a lot of people ascribe anger to gamers or gamer culture, but I think it's, with a 10-year remove, I can see it more about how, as a mark of how games were marketed and which were considered successful and why. And an art game like this, which is what it came to be known as, meant boredom. It meant no activity. It was weird and niche to look closely at the meaning of a game, even bizarre, which, I always understood that in didn't mind it. But I think there was also pushback as many of designers of these games also hated the term game and also avoided the term walking simulator, insisted on the game as art, as better than other games, which no way to upset gamers by saying that your game is better than theirs. So it was a confluence of factors. At the time it came out, the industry, I'll wrap up here in a second. The industry as a whole had been moving towards narrative-driven games as a form that had mass appeal. And it's hard to see this in hindsight, but I remember at the time that was a trend that a lot of the pieces that were about walking simulators would mark. So Dear Esther came at this time when a lot of gamers hit frustration with the trends in gaming, like a death of a lot of classic genres, a lot of franchises that were being changed for mass appeal. And the walking simulator became representative of a shallow experience that people were pushing back against, taking over the industry. So I think ultimately I became most interested in the walking simulator as someone thinks about technology as it relates to walking maps and like the kind of poetic practice of walking the same route over and over again to kind of read or name things as it forms an analog for how we navigate. It's important to wander. It's important to go off script or off road. It's important to notice things at the periphery. And as a writer, and Greg, I'm sure you too, like this genre, this form of noticing seems really natural. Like, we notice dialogue, eavesdrop, record, replay scripts in my mind, gather weird artifacts to make sense of an environment, and try to decode the world through small pieces of information. And so this game was very resonant in the sense of my only role is to bear witness and piece together facts and information, just like you do, in the world. So I think it's a challenge to replay a game like this once you've already done it. So I tend to like just watch walkthroughs. I don't really like to play it again. I rather would just have this going on in the background. And I think I'm most compelled by how the walking simulator is linked to cognition, how important wandering is for our learning, and further all of the aspects of a high fidelity simulation. At that time, this was high in quality. Now it seems almost quaint graphics wise, but I think of the high fidelity simulation as it relates to the construction of the world through simulation. So the design of cities and buildings and how we navigate them. That makes this form really compelling. And the simulator becomes a little kind of testing lab for noticing one's own cognitive tics and one's own learning style. What do I notice? What do I avoid? And you feel the world kind of opening up, or part of the brain opening up in a way. And that helped me make a bunch of exploration and my work with artists who work with simulation after. So that's my weird piece of alt history. I can either let this keep playing while you transition, Greg, if that's fine with you, or I can
Please do. It feels kind of appropriate that the journey keeps happening in the background.
Yeah, exactly.
And I have to admit, in preparing for this, I might have zoned out for several hours with the online complete playthrough playing. Gorgeous score in addition to the moody take it or leave it narration.
Oh, yeah.
So you pretty much tagged everything I wanted to ask you about in the outro of that. And I guess you were making me go off script because you said something right in the last couple sentences that I want to drill into immediately, and you referred to these graphics as quaint. I mean, I think they're pretty good. But I was just wondering if you could talk about this interest of or this idea of fidelity, what 10 years ago fidelity means graphically versus, the latest, greatest, whether it's Death Stranding or otherwise. And like, could this game have happened 10 years before 2012 and not been as immersive? I'm just kind of curious to hear you riff on fidelity and immersion a little bit.
Yeah, I think even as I said that at the end, that was I think the gamer side of me that just wanted to mark that the graphics were of their time. I honestly, rewatching this, also think this is pretty great. And I remember this is, I think this was a professor who made this game and had like stripped down a world to its components. I think it was an experiment in play for them, but I think there's a aspect in walking through a simulation where high fidelity is not necessarily what I'm looking for. What I think a world like this draws me to is the way that different objects in a simulation have this like metaphorical or symbolic weight. Like the world responsibility, if there is one, is to turn you to certain vistas or perspectives and allow you, of course, to, like, you're coming in with your taste and preferences and your way of interpretation. And so high fidelity is less interesting to me. Something like going on that bleeding razor edge of kind of a visual one-to-one replication, instead to see like what can a simulation do to orient you otherwise to other aspects in the world. So to like focus your attention, to zoom in, to look at the ocean from a different angle. Like for example, in this that we're looking at right here, and when I have walked on like rocky beaches and islands, I haven't really considered being low to the ground approaching the ocean ever before. This immediately puts me in like the mind of salamander, or what, I'm not trying to think what kind of animals in like a rocky, whatever kind of animal is in this rocky outcropping. But I'd never really thought about like moving low to the ground towards the ocean, or a turtle kind of approaching the sea, like those videos of little baby turtles going out to meet their their home environment. It's kind of like chthonic or subterranean perspective. And so just change, I mean, for me, it's the movement is more important than the high fidelity. Like seeing something perfectly rendered from the world is less interesting than this movement of like, where can this take me that I couldn't go anywhere else.
I know that the marketing of big games, like, oh, will we finally get Grand Theft Auto 6 after 10 years? But it's always like, oh, the world is 400% bigger now. On the top, and we can like, here's some screen captured teasers that show the light hitting a blade of grass. Like we have that in the
I mean, some of that work is that, like, the technical work that goes behind that is pretty incredible. And I think it's different when looking at human faces, like when you see human faces in games now, and how expression, like the mix of like mocap and AI and training all coming together into these like hyper realistic like facial expressions. And I think that relates more to like RPGs, where you have characters that you're actually looking at speak for an extended period of time. And I think I slot that into the work of inculcating the game player's belief in the character, which becomes so crucial to the experience of a game. Like, I think Death Stranding is a totally different topic, but there's some trolley aspects there. But that actor who's like the main person, Death Stranding, like it's pretty close to his facial expressions. I think I'm thinking it's him during a lot of the game, and then I'm like mapping the past films he was in onto it.
Daryl on The Walking Dead, if you're unfamiliar with Death Stranding.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's about creating a sense of belief in like the interiority of the character. And so I think in that, for that, the high fidelity simulation is really interesting. It's like, what can game companies like get us to believe, and how deeply invested can we become in a character? And as it turns out, super invested, and like people feel like they're companions, and reams of fan fiction are developed. But I think in environmental storytelling, there's a lot of beauty to high fidelity, but I'm not sure it's always the main goal. It should be always the main goal, the ultimate
and
goal.
I guess weirdly, this came up in the demo scene conversation with Karsten Schmidt, because there we started talking about like 4 and 8-bit graphics. But like, it feels like, I mean, nobody would disagree with this, but we've hit some kind of resolution threshold where like 4K is quite a lot, thank you.
Yeah.
And like doubling or quadrupling that, okay, the blade of grass looks that much better, but
and it's interesting. I wonder, I mean, for you, when you between like 4K and 8K, like what is there something maybe to think about, is like, what does one get from 8K that one doesn't get in 4K? Like, do you believe it even even more in what you're seeing? And then how does that then change your experience of the game? Or is it all of these other components that make a world believable? Because in a lot of writing about creating a believable fiction, it's about the selection of detail and like the curation of specific details that create a sense of belief. It's not necessarily that everything is perfectly rendered to replicate. That's actually cognitively, like, we need some things left out. And belief is actually drawn from like a set of details that our mind pulls together to say, okay, I believe. Don't actually, threshold's quite a lot lower than 8K.
Yeah, because we all have a pretty, like, an HD image in our head when we're reading a novel of that room or whatever, and maybe we don't know what's on the other wall because it's not mentioned, but it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Your mind will put it there. It'll place it there. Even with like the split that came up at this time about against walking simulators, like as I went back into, like, I dug deep into Reddit and a bunch of forums, and I also found like incredibly nuanced responses from lots of people in like these argument threads where people were saying precisely what you would hear a media theorist say, which is there's so many forms of media and there's so many forms of like game-like experiences, and that the idea that what a game should be or whether a game is art, you know, many people identified, even I found this thread from like a year ago where it was like, does anyone remember the rage about walking simulators? What was all about? And people were like thoughtfully, beautifully reflecting on the range of media that they had been turned to by these experiences. And I guess, you know, I shared that Fogo Island talk that is like the grounds for this book, The Artificial and the Real. And when I was on that island, one thing I thought about a lot is like the way that this game became a launch for thinking about the practice of naming and how we name and describe. How do we approach land? What do we keep in mind? And you know, walking from point to point in a place you don't know, it turned out that I've been doing that forever in games like this, and it burnt into my mind on a level I didn't even realize until I was walking an island like Dear Esther 10 years later, or maybe 8 years later after playing the game for the first time. So training in this made me more heightened aware of what I was doing. I was walking the island, why I was looking, whose eyes I was looking with, and then all the, you know, theory and critique that I also had in thinking about how you approach land. This kind of game like requires, I think, a kind of suspension of self that is unnerving for a lot of people. There's to have no goal is unnerving for a lot. What am I supposed to be doing? Oh, you're just actually meant to explore the tension of you with this narrator and just linger in that for 2 or 3 hours, mapping your own experience atop. I think once you start to relax into that, the charms of this start to come up. But I can talk about walking later.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about too is this, like, okay, you're alone with somebody's thoughts, and is that the reason that these people didn't like the game? I mean, maybe it wasn't exactly their thoughts, but they just resented the idea of being alone with your thoughts, and that was something to start swinging at.
Thoughts. Yeah, exactly. Or the thoughts of someone who you don't want to listen to. That's that's fair. That's fair. That's a fair, reasonable critique. I also don't understand a lot of like the terms that the narrators use. Something about a bent bonnet.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that line too. Yeah.
I don't know what century we're in. I just realized I didn't know what century. I thought this was like post World War II, but now maybe it's the 1800s.
Yeah.
But I think I'm very interested in the way that walking in this game, walking an island in a game, walking an island in real life, how these layers start to collapse, and how each point that you kind of zoom in Dear Esther like started to help me think about naming different points, like whether it was an outlook or rocky outcropping. Fogo doesn't look exactly like this, but the walk is quite wild this way. And each time I would return to a point, as when like rewatching Dear Esther, each point is named differently. Like if I looked at this 5 years ago, I would have completely different associations with each piece, with each place that I stop at. And so the landscape becomes a way to like reflect on, me moving through time, how what different references I'm going to bring to this 5 years from now or 10 years from now. What did I bring to it 10 years ago? It becomes this kind of not tapestry. I'm losing metaphors. Just think this place that, it's the kind of grooves in your mind, like each time you go over the same place, it creates a deeper kind of network in your mind, like the node is crossed over and over again. So I think that like this is an exterior, like an external version of that, like a psychogeographic kind of space that has an analog to how you create a sense of a place in your mind. So I'm trying to like articulate that in the book is how does the virtual landscape and the actual if you bring to a real landscape the thinking that you have in a virtual landscape, what do you learn about how you navigate or move through space and also move through your mind?
Okay, I've got a question for you. So this is all very pastoral, but where do you sit with our urban versions of this, whether it's like, I don't know, Cyberpunk 2077 or GTA X, whatever that is? Do you get that? I mean, I know that this has like a particular narrative that creates a particular atmosphere, but I don't know, are you affected in the same way by this type of space in that's urban? Because I mean, I know you live in Los Angeles, so you're surrounded by cities.
I love GTA 5. I mean, I think at the time I was playing DRS, I was also playing Grand Theft Auto 5 heavily, which was known at the time. Rockstar put a lot of time and effort and photographing Los Angeles and building the game to such a degree that like when you were walking around LA, there are aspects downtown. There are like certain buildings downtown that from a certain angle, I first think of GTA, and then I think of like it reminds me of seeing it in the game so many times. I think there's a different. I haven't done a walking simulator in a city. That's actually really interesting. I can't think of a single game where I'm just walking around a city. It's always this kind of fantasy landscape. But I do spend a lot of time in GTA 5, and this was like a long form essay wrote for Killscreen at the time, which was both about toxic masculinity in the game and like the different ways that I as a femme were inhabiting all of these different types of masculinity in the game. But then also the wandering in GTA, I mean, because you can spend countless hours like in the desert or wandering the city. And I think in a way I got to know Los Angeles through, the fictional GTA version of it. And then also was thinking about documentaries like Los Angeles Plays Itself, where, the city reflects itself back to itself over and over and over again, which I think was done really well in the game. I don't know how many people have written about it or explored that. But I like that. I haven't thought about a city walking simulator. I'm sure there are, and I just don't know them.
Yeah. I mean, I know one thing that always ruins whatever sense of immersion one could have in one of these is the bumbling NPCs that would have, which is a not kind way to think of all the people in a city, but in game, like it's hard to, I know we can have people wandering around aimlessly, but
yeah, when you can drive through a person, somehow it's not it like really takes away from the peaceful meditation. Like it's a very different experience. I mean, GTA is obviously a very violent game.
Yeah.
And Los Angeles is a very violent city. So I see in my mind, they're not one-to-one, but I think that's what the game was getting at.
Okay. Well, back to my thinking about your recommendations. And you gave quite an awesome chronology of, I won't call them art games because Death Stranding was in there, but are there any other kind of games that you think came after DRS there beyond the ones you mentioned that maybe do something similar psychologically or interesting in a similar way?
I think Red Dead Redemption was another, and not a walking simulator, but a lot of time spent on horseback, just like running, walking, or your horse is walking you through a lot of spaces. A lot of the side quests and like NPCs and Red Dead Redemption have incredible narrative. Like, I mean, it's really a world where you need to like listen carefully and like you need to have a sense of the history of the world and the characters in it. I think Last of Us 2 is incredible for this. I'm really bad at Last of Us 2. Like there are a lot of points where I had to get someone else or ask a friend to like help me shoot and kill whatever those creatures are. But the best parts of Last of Us for me are like wandering. I think it's Seattle at some point, if it's Seattle or like the outskirts of Seattle, and looking at how they like render the ruins of like a known American city. Yeah, those are the two that come to mind. There's are games that I find more in going off road and exploring, like just marveling at like the time and effort that is put into like the environmental design and all the thinking that all the hidden narrative that's in that.
Yeah. I started playing Last of Us because it finally came out on the PC. I don't have a console. And I was like thoroughly interested in the world and thoroughly interested in all the gamey stuff, like the sneaking and killing. And I was like, oh, so I didn't get that far into it. And all interestingly too, this is where we are in 2023, that I could come to the game after having watched the television show, which already put an idea in my head about what these cities should look like.
So you watched the show first, then played the game?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I haven't even touched the show because I'm so attached to the game. That's interesting. What was that experience like playing it?
Weird. I need to do it more. I mean, it's hard to compare the show. I can see they actually, I think the production designers and cinematographers, whatever, the TV director of photography, whatever it's called on TV, I think they did a really good job of taking, I guess there was like these specific, they kind of made some of the levels or moments into bigger scenes and vistas. Anyways, it's pretty, not that we're doing TV recommendations here, but it's quite engaging, the writing. They did some really interesting stuff, and I haven't got far enough in it to know if all the characters in the show and how their backstories line up, but there's some pretty surprising and sophisticated writing. There was like it had its own backlash actually around some queer storylines that weren't as visibly evident in the TV show. And they were quite touching and affecting and beautiful. And again, people were like complaining about, not staying true to the narrative, leave my fantasy alone, like you talked about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I did read a lot about how the show also, like, they worked very hard to stay close to the game, knowing that it's tied to such an intense feeling fan base. I'll have to do both. I like the idea of going from the game to the show back to the game. I'll see how that works out.
Yeah,
but this question of fidelity is so interesting.
Yeah. Well, I guess what is your, I mean, you mentioned Fogo Island, like, do you have I don't want to be too poncy about it, but like a flaneur practice outside of, or do you only wander around when you're on beautiful islands?
I do. I mean, walking, like, with a lot of writers, it's like a way to clear my head. It's a way to let things kind of percolate in the background. Los Angeles is a hard city to walk around. It's like not a very walkable place, but when I am able to find a good place to walk, it definitely, like, I like to go out with like a puzzle or problem in an essay or whatever I happen to be working on, and just have it background processing in my mind. And usually the more I allow myself to wander in the city and the more I allow myself not to think directly on the issue, like, I find there's something about walking that allows you to like reposition it in your mind, or like I can kind of feel it turning around in my brain, and I'm able to find some kind of resolution. So it's super helpful if there are other writers out there who are struggling with a knot. I suggest go take like a 3-hour walk.
I'm the same way. It's not always necessarily tied to productivity, like, as in this.
Yeah.
I guess it's like the most productive procrastination possible.
As I've always said, nothing's procrastination. Everything is writing. Even when you're not, especially when you're
like
not.
That. Okay. Well, here's two things. Okay, I got 2 more questions, and the first one is a quick one. And maybe we can be quick with it, because I know, you and me have a different relationship, and maybe the viewers of this video, with like putting art in front of any word versus maybe people in other communities. And if we wanted to be derisive, we could call, a first-person shooter a man shooter, in the same way that we call this a walking simulator, because I've heard that used a lot to describe those first-person shooter games, and it's similarly ungenerous. But do you think that the art game, like, framing is productive or not? I'm just curious. No.
No, definitely. I do not think it's productive because I think it creates this when it creates this hierarchy, it like reproduces the gatekeeping and elitism that these kinds of arguments about whether it's a game or not that people are decry or chafe against. And I think it's like a reaction to the terms of like that conversation. Like if someone says it's not a game, one will probably, like if you put a lot of time and effort into something, react with like, yes, this is more than a game. It's more real of a game than you've ever gamed in your life. And so when moving away from that binary kind of thinking of like one thing is art or not. I mean, I think there are artful moving moments in first person shooters and massive like war games like Battlefield. I'm never a Call of Duty person, but I did love Battlefield. I mean, there's art in all of these experiences. Maybe it's not called art or it's not described as such, but I think there's no differentiation in my mind about whether games are art or not. I think they're film, their narrative, their their poetry, their world building, their engineering, their technical like feats, their collaborative like marbles too. If you've ever been to a game studio and watched how many people it takes to like create like the sound of silence in a game like Dead Space, or looked at like the 100,000 pages of like dialogue trees for like even a very basic RPG and like the amount of work and time that goes into it. I think of them as more than I think of them as art and film and narrative, all of these things together. And so I think the games as art discussion is doesn't allow us to see games for what they are, which is just like intense collaborative world building effort that draws on all of these genres. And there are artful elements to it, but then there's also like engineering marvel to it as well. So they just for me, they sit in another category. I think the games is our discussion. Like it's often very useful to talk about some games within an art context.
Yep.
Because it allows you to like look at aspects of them or the artistic practice of the maker, allows us to talk about games in a specific kind of way. But defining a genre as art or not art seems less interesting to me. I think it's ultimately like, do you meet the person who made the thing on the terms and the rules that they've established? Like, are you taking what they're arguing for or have put into the world seriously, like on its own terms, rather than trying to slot it into one thing or another? Like how doesn't allow you to see the thing. So I think as a writer, that's what I always hope for, is like, can I move with the work, and can I meet the work in what it's offering?
Okay, great. I like that a lot. Okay, so closing question, and I know you have relationships with a lot of artists that are working in this, what we might broadly call simulation space, or exploring simulation as medium object. Who would your list of artists for our curious, stepping away from Dear Esther, who would you recommend as kind of artists for our viewers to check out that are kind of deeply thinking about some of these themes and notions of simulation you've touched on in your talk today?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think they'll probably be artists that folks have heard of, but some of the artists I'm working with right now come to mind, partly because they're most on mine, but Daniel Brathwaite Shirley is an incredible artist who plays with like different generations of graphics, like in a work that they're developing right now. Lawrence Leck is someone who I think has developed simulation as practice, games and simulation as artworks, and like developing out the larger world around a game for like 10 years now, and is somebody to really pay attention to. Jakob Steensen, of course, is someone that I really respect. Who are others? Shuang Li is an artist that I've been working with and looking at a lot. Yeah, those are a few folks who come to mind as people who maybe had gaming in like their repertoire, like are using like the metaphors and kind of like off-road capacities of games and like taking like certain details and pulling the thread and then developing that into a world. I think those are all artists that I admire and like look to often of, oh, I'm not the only person wandering the game to look at what's happening in this tiny corner of this cave. Like this is a way of looking that actually generates practice and world building. So yeah.
And just to connect that back to your previous question, I mean, one of the things I think about all those artists, and they all are certainly worth investigating, is they, we talked about art game not being maybe a productive category, but like once you take the game and put it in a gallery or disassociate it from these type of experiences, it becomes a different thing. And maybe is, art game isn't productive, but game in the repertoire of the artist.
Yeah, or exactly. So like maybe it's what this is helping me like frame is maybe it's art as a context helps us talk about games in a certain way. A game in a film context allows you to talk about it a certain way, in a media theory context in another, in a gaming context in another. There are just so many aspects of a game or a game world to explore that I think you do need different lexicons and styles of like interpretation to explore different aspects of what the world is doing and how it was made. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. This has been some fine spelunking.
Yeah, we dove down.
Nora, thank you so much for taking us on a journey today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And that concludes the 5th Alt History and the series for 2023. And please join us again next year for another round of talks delving into digital cultures, lost narratives. Thanks again, Nora.
Thank you.